The fastest way to destroy a corporation is to humiliate the one woman who understands where all the protections are buried. Nobody spoke after I said that inside the executive conference room on the 42nd floor because deep down every person sitting at that polished glass table thought I was joking. Rain pressed softly against the skyscraper windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while executives shifted in leather chairs beneath dim, recessed lighting and glowing presentation screens filled with restructuring charts. Annual leadership review meetings always carried the same atmosphere inside Mercer Vale Holdings. Expensive coffee, controlled smiles, carefully rehearsed confidence hiding panic underneath quarterly pressure. I had attended 17 of those meetings as Senior Executive Governance Coordinator, which meant I spent nearly 2 decades quietly protecting leadership teams from governance exposure they barely understood themselves. But people only respect invisible work when it disappears. That morning, the chief executive officer decided he was tired of departments that did not generate visible revenue. Corporate streamlining. He called it while standing near the projection screen with his tailored navy suit and rehearsed executive voice echoing calmly through the boardroom. We are eliminating redundant operational oversight structures effective immediately. Redundant. Funny word considering half the executives inside that room had signed compensation packages, succession protections, and leadership liability clauses I personally structured over 17 years to keep the company from collapsing under shareholder litigation during internal transitions. But executives never think about the architecture beneath power. They only notice the stage lights above it. I sat quietly halfway down the conference table beside legal binders and governance reports, while human resources representatives typed notes into silver laptops without looking at me directly. The chief financial officer avoided eye contact completely. That was my first warning something had already been decided before the meeting began. Then the chief executive officer turned toward me publicly with the kind of smile powerful men use right before they try humiliating someone they believe cannot fight back. Evelyn Carter, he said smoothly, your department represents an outdated governance model this company no longer requires. Around the table, several vice presidents shifted uncomfortably, while others stared carefully at presentation screens pretending not to witness what was happening. Public executive humiliation always creates the same silence. Nobody interrupts because everyone becomes afraid of becoming next. Your position is being terminated effective immediately, he continued. Human resources will assist with transition procedures. Transition procedures. 17 years reduced to corporate vocabulary, designed to sound efficient instead of cruel. One human resources manager slid a termination packet quietly across the polished glass table toward me while security personnel appeared near the conference room entrance with badges already prepared. That part caught my attention immediately because it meant the firing was prearranged before the meeting even started. My executive credentials had likely already been disabled upstairs, while the chief executive officer performed leadership theater for the board. Still I remained calm. That unsettled them more than anger would have. Of course, I said softly while closing the governance binder in front of me. The chief executive officer relaxed slightly, hearing compliance instead of resistance. Then he made the mistake that destroyed everything afterward. We appreciate your administrative service, he added casually. Administrative. Around the room, several legal staff members lowered their eyes immediately because unlike the executives, they understood exactly what my department actually handled. Governance continuity, executive protection structures, board liability sequencing, succession activation protocols, compensation containment clauses, internal retaliation safeguards, invisible systems protecting leadership from itself every single day. I stood slowly from the conference table and gathered my documents calmly while rain streaked across the skyline behind the glass walls. Outside. Before I leave, I said quietly, you should review Clause 8.4 before processing a public executive governance termination during an active restructuring quarter. The room changed instantly after that. Not dramatically. Quietly. The general counsel stopped typing. One board advisor looked up sharply from his tablet. Even the chief financial officer finally raised his eyes toward me for the first time all morning. Only the chief executive officer kept smiling because he clearly had never read the clause himself. Human resources already approved this process, he replied confidently. I almost felt sorry for him hearing that. Almost. Because human resources did not write the governance architecture protecting Mercer Vale Holdings from executive retaliation exposure during leadership restructuring events. I did. And somewhere beneath the polished confidence still hanging inside that expensive boardroom, several people had just realized the company may have violated its own protections publicly in front of witnesses. The elevator ride from the executive floor to the lobby lasted less than a minute, but by the time the doors opened, the entire atmosphere inside Mercer Vale Holdings already felt different. News travels strangely fast through corporate towers. Not through announcements. Through silence. Through assistants suddenly avoiding eye contact. Through compliance employees whispering beside printers while pretending to organize paperwork. Through executives walking too quickly down marble hallways because panic always accelerates expensive shoes. I carried a single storage box through the lobby beneath towering glass walls overlooking rain-covered Chicago streets, while my disabled badge rested uselessly inside my coat pocket beside 17 years of executive governance credentials. 2 security officers followed several steps behind me, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. One of them finally spoke quietly near the revolving doors. "Miss Carter, I am sorry about this." I almost smiled hearing that because people at the bottom of corporate structures usually understand dignity better than people at the top. Outside, cold rain drifted across Michigan Avenue while black company sedans lined the curb beneath the building awning. I stood there for a moment watching reflections shimmer across wet pavement, while my phone vibrated repeatedly inside my purse. 3 missed calls already. Legal department. Deputy compliance officer. Then another call from Internal Governance Council. That one mattered. Around the 43rd floor above me, executives were probably still pretending the meeting had ended normally. But somewhere inside the legal department someone had finally opened Clause 8.4. I knew exactly what they were reading because I helped structure the language myself 12 years earlier after a governance crisis nearly exposed the company during an executive retaliation lawsuit. Public termination of governance personnel during active restructuring quarters automatically triggered independent board review protections. Not optional review. Automatic review. The clause existed specifically to prevent executives from silencing internal governance oversight during sensitive leadership transitions. Most executives never read the governance architecture protecting them because they assume legal continuity simply exists naturally around power. It does not. People build it. People maintain it quietly for years. Around 1:30 that afternoon, I sat alone inside a small Italian cafe 3 blocks from the tower while rain pressed softly against fogged windows and office workers hurried past outside beneath umbrellas. My untouched coffee had already gone cold by the time the first internal message arrived from a junior compliance analyst I trusted. Executive compensation approvals just froze. There it was. The first visible crack. Compensation systems tied directly into restructuring governance protections, which meant once the board review protocols activated, executive advancement pathways automatically paused until legal exposure evaluations finished processing internally.
Novo unesis. No sexescen premouschens. No compensascen madefecascens.
No executive mobility. The systems were functioning exactly as designed. Mercer Vale protected itself from leadership recklessness long before most of the current executives ever entered the building. Another message arrived 3 minutes later. Human Resources says it is probably temporary. I looked out toward the rain-covered sidewalks beyond the cafe windows, because Human Resources always says that during the first hour of corporate panic. Temporary. Administrative delay. Technical review. Harmless language people used before understanding the scale of what they triggered. Then my phone rang again. This time from the chief financial officer directly. Earlier that morning he could not even meet my eyes across the conference table. Now his name glowed across my screen beneath the soft noise of espresso machines and quiet afternoon conversations around me. I let the call continue ringing while downtown Chicago traffic crawled slowly through the rain outside. A second message appeared before the ringing stopped. Board counsel is requesting immediate clarification regarding governance exposure. Clarification. Another corporate word executives use when they are too frightened to say the real thing out loud yet. Exposure. Somewhere above the city inside Mercer Vale Holdings, leadership was beginning to understand something dangerous. They had not removed an administrative employee publicly during restructuring season. They may have accidentally activated protections designed to stop executives exactly like them. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the executive floor inside Mercer Vale Holdings no longer felt like a leadership center. It felt like a building waiting for bad news nobody wanted to say out loud first. Rain continued sliding across the skyscraper windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying legal binders and printed governance reports with the nervous speed people develop once executives stop pretending everything is under control. Earlier that morning, the chief executive officer stood confidently beneath presentation screens discussing operational efficiency and leadership modernization. Now half the executive floor remained locked inside emergency meetings with internal counsel, while compensation dashboards across the company displayed temporary authorization. Holds nobody in human resources could remove. I knew exactly when the situation turned from concern into fear, because another message arrived from the junior compliance analyst shortly after 3:15. The board activated independent review authority. I stared at the words for several seconds while quiet jazz music drifted through the cafe speakers around me, because independent review authority only activated under one condition. The board believed leadership exposure might already exist. Not potential inconvenience. Not administrative confusion. Exposure. Which meant outside directors were now reviewing whether the public termination violated retaliation protections tied directly into restructuring governance procedures. Another message arrived less than a minute later. Executive promotion pathways are frozen company-wide. There it was. The real panic point. Executives tolerate investigations. They tolerate legal reviews. What they cannot tolerate is stalled advancement. Mercer Vale tied compensation increases, succession movement, and executive retention packages directly into governance compliance sequencing years earlier after shareholders demanded stronger internal protections following a leadership scandal in Boston. Most current executives barely remembered those reforms because stability makes powerful people forget why safeguards exist. But the systems remembered. The systems always remembered. Around 3:30, my phone finally rang again from the chief executive officer himself. Earlier that morning he could barely hide his satisfaction while terminating me publicly in front of vice presidents and board advisors. Now his voice sounded tight before I even answered. "Evelyn," he began carefully, "there appears to be some confusion regarding internal review procedures." Confusion. Another executive word designed to soften accountability before consequences become visible publicly. I remained quiet long enough for the silence to pressure him instead. "Legal believes Clause 8.4 may have triggered automatically," he continued. "May have. As if governance protections accidentally activate themselves for entertainment." Outside the cafe windows, traffic lights reflected across wet Chicago streets while office workers hurried beneath umbrellas through cold afternoon rain. "It did trigger automatically," I replied calmly. Silence answered first. Then his voice lowered noticeably. "Human Resources approved the termination sequence. Human Resources does not override governance architecture during active restructuring quarters," I said quietly. "You signed those protections yourself 6 years ago." Another long silence followed because somewhere deep underneath executive arrogance, he was finally beginning to understand something terrifying. The systems restricting his authority right now were not external punishments. They were protections his own leadership team demanded years earlier to shield Mercer Vale from reckless executive behavior during internal transitions. He just never imagined the protections could apply to him personally. Around 4 o'clock, another internal message appeared from compliance. "Board advisors are requesting all governance continuity records connected to your department." That mattered because continuity records contained every executive sequencing dependency tied to compensation, succession approvals, retention structures, and leadership review protections. Most executives thought my department handled administrative paperwork. In reality, we maintained the invisible architecture controlling how executive authority legally moved through the corporation itself. Then one final message appeared beneath the others while rain darkened the skyline outside. "Human Resources is trying to reverse the termination retroactively." I almost laughed reading that because governance systems do not care about embarrassment. Once the clause activated publicly in front of witnesses, the process no longer belonged to Human Resources. It belonged to the board. By late afternoon, Mercer Vale Holdings had stopped behaving like a corporation and started behaving like a law firm preparing for impact. The atmosphere inside the executive tower shifted completely once board review authority officially moved beyond internal counsel and into independent governance oversight. Elevators opened constantly across the executive floors while outside attorneys carrying leather portfolios disappeared into conference rooms behind frosted glass walls. Administrative assistants stopped smiling in hallways. Human resources representatives suddenly moved carefully through conversations like people walking across thin ice above freezing water. Nobody knew exactly how serious the exposure was yet, but everyone understood one thing now. The systems restricting leadership authority were no longer internal inconveniences. They were active corporate protections. Around 4:30, another message arrived from the junior compliance analyst still trapped inside the building. Executive Compensation Committee emergency meeting scheduled for 6 o'clock. That mattered more than most employees inside Mercer Vale would ever understand because compensation committees only met under emergency authority when leadership stability itself became questionable. Compensation freezes were no longer temporary administrative holds. They were indicators the board might be preparing to isolate executive risk exposure before shareholders noticed instability publicly. Outside the cafe windows, Chicago traffic crawled slowly beneath darkening skies while cold rain streaked across passing buses and black sedans moving through downtown intersections. I sat quietly beside untouched coffee reviewing old governance notes from memory because deep down I already knew exactly what the board was discovering upstairs. Clause 8.4 never existed alone. It connected directly into succession sequencing, retaliation prevention architecture, executive continuity protections, and independent review authority pathways embedded throughout Mercer Vale governance structures years earlier, after federal scrutiny forced the company to modernize leadership accountability procedures. Most executives treated those reforms like symbolic legal maintenance. I treated them like infrastructure. Around 5 o'clock, the Deputy General Counsel finally called me directly. Unlike the executives, his voice carried no arrogance now, only exhaustion. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "the board wants clarification regarding procedural intent. Behind Clause 8.4 integration. Procedural intent. Legal language for asking whether leadership may have accidentally triggered governance retaliation protections, exactly as designed. The clause exists to prevent executives from publicly removing governance oversight during active restructuring events," I replied calmly. Silence followed briefly before he spoke again more carefully. "The board believes the public nature of the termination may have escalated exposure classification." Public nature. There it was. The detail nobody upstairs considered important, while the chief executive officer performed authority in front of vice presidents and human resources staff earlier that morning. Private removal procedures likely would have triggered contained review. Public humiliation during restructuring season in front of witnesses activated escalation pathways tied directly into independent governance preservation protocols. The board was not reacting emotionally. The board was reacting structurally. Another message interrupted the call while rain hammered harder against the cafe windows outside. Chief Executive Officer succession pathway suspended. I stared at the screen for several seconds because that was the moment everything changed internally. Executive investigations create tension. Succession freezes create fear. Mercer Vale had spent years carefully positioning the Chief Executive Officer for expanded authority during upcoming acquisition negotiations scheduled later that quarter. Now the governance systems themselves had temporarily blocked his advancement pending exposure review. All because leadership dismissed the woman maintaining the invisible architecture protecting executive continuity in the first place. Human Resources is trying to argue administrative misunderstanding, the Deputy General Counsel admitted quietly over the phone. I almost smiled hearing that because corporations always attempt minimizing structural failure into communication, mistakes once accountability becomes dangerous. But governance systems do not evaluate intentions. They evaluate sequence, procedure, exposure, witnesses, documentation, timing, the exact things executives ignore when ego convinces them authority outranks structure. Around 5:30, another message appeared from inside Mercer Vale. Only 6 words this time. Board chair requested your direct attendance. I looked out toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the fogged cafe windows, while downtown office lights slowly illuminated the darkening city outside. Somewhere 42 floors above Michigan Avenue, the people who publicly humiliated me that morning were beginning to understand something terrifying. The corporation no longer trusted them to govern themselves. By 6:15 that evening, the atmosphere inside Mercer Vale Holdings had become something far more dangerous than panic. It had become realization. Executives can survive lawsuits. They can survive shareholder pressure, bad press, even failed acquisitions if enough authority still surrounds them. But once leadership realizes the systems protecting their careers no longer trust them, fear changes shape completely. Outside, rain swept across downtown Chicago while executive floor lights glowed against the darkening skyline like isolated islands suspended above the city. Inside the tower, conference room doors remained closed across nearly every senior leadership corridor, while legal assistants carried printed governance binders between emergency meetings beneath silent marble hallways. Earlier that morning, Human Resources called my department redundant administrative overhead. Now the entire corporation had stopped moving without the governance architecture my department quietly maintained for 17 years. Another message arrived from the junior compliance analyst shortly after 6:20. The chief executive officer just lost voting support from 2 board directors. I leaned back slowly inside the cafe booth while soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty restaurant around me, because board support never disappears publicly, unless private conversations have already turned hostile behind closed doors. That meant directors were no longer asking whether leadership triggered governance exposure accidentally. They were asking whether the chief executive officer could still be trusted to lead during the investigation itself. Around 6:30, my phone rang again from an unfamiliar internal extension. This time the voice belonged to the chair of the Executive Compensation Committee. I had worked with him quietly for over a decade reviewing succession continuity structures during acquisitions and restructuring seasons. Unlike most executives inside Mercer Vale, he always understood governance work mattered precisely because nobody noticed it publicly when functioning correctly. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "the board is reviewing continuity records connected to executive protection sequencing." Continuity records. Those files contain 17 years of governance intervention history, quiet corrections, escalation prevention, clause containment, internal sequencing repairs protecting executives from triggering liability exposure during rushed leadership decisions. Most of those interventions were invisible because governance departments only succeed when disasters never become visible publicly. "You prevented this company from violating its own protections dozens of times," he admitted quietly. Outside the windows, rainwater streamed beneath Chicago streetlights while traffic crawled through evening congestion below the skyscrapers. Hearing him finally say it aloud felt strangely empty because recognition arriving only after collapse never truly feels like respect. Feels like archaeology, digging through damage to discover what was holding the structure upright all along. Another message interrupted the call. Media relations preparing internal crisis response draft. That escalated things further because public relations departments only enter governance events once leadership believes exposure may spread outside the corporation itself. Somewhere upstairs, communications executives were likely preparing carefully sanitized language describing temporary governance review procedures while avoiding words like retaliation, clause activation, executive freeze, or board intervention. Corporate language always tries making structural fear sound administrative. Around 7 o'clock, the compensation committee chair lowered his voice further. "The board believes the chief executive officer may have violated procedural safeguards knowingly. That mattered more than everything before it, because accidental exposure creates remediation pathways. Knowing violations create trust collapse." "He never read the protections," I replied calmly. "He assumed governance existed to protect leadership from employees." Silence answered me for several seconds because deep down everyone inside Mercer Vale was finally beginning to understand the truth. Governance never existed to protect executives from workers. Governance existed to protect corporations from executives. Another message appeared beneath the others while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the city skyline outside. Human Resources Director placed under temporary review restriction. The systems were still moving exactly as designed. Clause by clause. Sequence by sequence. one executive career at a time, and somewhere 42 floors above Michigan Avenue, the people who publicly humiliated me that morning were slowly discovering something terrifying. The invisible woman they dismissed as paperwork had been quietly protecting all of them from themselves. By 7:30 that night, Mercer Vale Holdings no longer resembled the confident corporate empire displayed in shareholder presentations and financial interviews. The executive tower had become a containment zone built entirely from legal exposure, frozen authority, and frightened leadership trying desperately to understand governance systems they ignored for years because one quiet woman handled them invisibly in the background. Rain hammered harder against the skyscraper windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while conference room lights glowed across the executive floors long after most employees had already gone home. Inside those rooms, attorneys, board advisors, and compensation analysts moved through governance documents page by page searching for procedural escape routes that did not exist. The systems were functioning correctly. That was the problem. Around 7:45, another message arrived from the junior compliance analyst still inside the tower. The board suspended executive succession, voting indefinitely. I stared at the screen while soft reflections from passing traffic moved across the cafe windows, because succession suspension meant the governance crisis had expanded beyond one public termination. The board no longer trusted leadership continuity itself. Promotions frozen, compensation restricted, succession blocked, executive mobility suspended, all triggered because the chief executive officer publicly humiliated governance oversight during an active restructuring cycle without understanding the protections built into the corporation beneath him. My phone rang again seconds later. This time the board chair called directly. His voice carried the calm exhaustion of someone who spent decades managing powerful people long enough to recognize when ego creates institutional damage. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "the board would like your assistance understanding the continuity architecture connected to Clause 8.4. Assistance. Interesting word considering human resources escorted me from the building less than 8 hours earlier like replaceable administrative staff. The architecture is functioning exactly as designed," I replied calmly. Silence answered me briefly before he continued more carefully. "That may be true, but nobody currently inside executive leadership fully understands the sequence dependencies." Of course they did not. Most executives only understand visible authority. Governance architecture exists beneath visibility. Quiet protections, escalation sequencing, compensation containment pathways, independent review triggers, internal preservation systems designed specifically to limit executive recklessness during sensitive transitions. The people who build those structures rarely appear on stage beside leadership because corporations treat infrastructure like wallpaper until the walls begin cracking publicly. Around 8 o'clock, another internal message appeared on my phone. Human Resources Director escorted from executive floor. That escalated things further than even I expected because temporary review restrictions usually happened quietly. Executive escorts meant the board believed procedural contamination might already exist inside the investigation itself. Somewhere high above Michigan Avenue, the same human resources leadership that publicly called my department redundant earlier that morning was now losing access to executive authority corridors one badge at a time. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the Chicago skyline while reflections shimmered along rain-covered streets beneath glowing office towers. I sat quietly watching the storm move through the city because deep down none of this felt victorious. It felt inevitable. Governance systems are designed exactly for moments like this. Moments when powerful people mistake institutional protection for personal immunity. Around 8:20, the board chair lowered his voice slightly over the phone. "The chief executive officer insists this is a procedural misunderstanding." I almost smiled hearing that because executive panic always passes through predictable stages. Confidence, confusion, minimization, blame. Then finally fear once authority stops responding automatically. The board is concerned the public nature of the termination created retaliatory appearance exposure. He continued carefully. Appearance exposure. Corporate language for visible humiliation creating legal vulnerability in front of witnesses. "It was not the appearance that triggered the clause," I replied softly. "It was the sequence." Another long silence followed because somewhere inside Mercer Vale Holdings, directors were finally beginning to understand something dangerous. The corporation did not collapse because executives broke a rule. It collapsed because they publicly revealed they never understood the system protecting them in the first place. Then one final message arrived beneath the others while rain crashed against the windows outside. Board requests your presence tomorrow morning. After 17 years of invisible governance work, the same people who erased me publicly now needed the woman they called administrative overhead to explain how their own corporation actually survived itself. The next morning, downtown Chicago looked washed clean beneath pale gray skies and cold wind moving between the skyscrapers along Michigan Avenue. Mercer Vale Holdings towered above the street exactly as it always had. Polished glass reflecting the city with the same illusion of stability corporations spend billions trying to maintain publicly. But stability inside that building no longer existed. Not after the board froze succession authority overnight. Not after executive compensation protections stalled. Not after governance systems quietly turned against the people who thought they controlled them. I stepped through the revolving doors at 8:10 carrying the same leather portfolio I brought to work for nearly 17 years. The difference was the silence. Security officers who avoided my eyes yesterday morning now stood straighter when I entered the lobby. Reception staff stopped whispering. Even the marble floors seemed louder beneath my heels as I crossed toward the executive elevators. Fear changes corporate atmospheres faster than layoffs ever do. One compliance analyst waiting near the elevators glanced toward me with visible relief before quickly looking away again. That told me everything already. The building was still frozen. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a woman human resources called unnecessary, less than 24 hours earlier. Yet somewhere above me, the board of directors was waiting for the same woman to explain why the corporation could no longer move forward without her systems functioning properly. The executive floor opened into complete silence.
No casual holwa conversations.
No confident laughter from conference rooms. No assistants rushing with coffee orders for leadership meetings. Only legal teams carrying binders between offices while executives avoided direct eye contact beneath dim recessed lighting. The atmosphere reminded me of hospitals during severe storms. Calm on the surface. Panic underneath every quiet movement. As I walked past the governance division corridor, several younger analysts stood slowly from their desks. One of them finally spoke in almost a whisper. "Miss Carter, we did not know they were going to do that publicly." I nodded once because none of this belonged to them. Young employees always believe corporations reward competence until they witness leadership protecting ego instead of infrastructure. The board meeting waited inside the same executive conference room where I was terminated publicly the previous morning. Only now the energy had changed completely. Yesterday, the chief executive officer stood near the windows projecting confidence, while human resources distributed termination paperwork. Today, outside attorneys occupied half the room while board directors reviewed governance reports spread across the long glass table. The chief executive officer looked exhausted beneath the bright overhead lighting. The human resources director's chair remained empty entirely. Nobody invited her back after the review restrictions activated overnight. "Miss Carter," the board chair said carefully as I entered. "Thank you for coming." Interesting how quickly language changes once power becomes unstable. Yesterday I was administrative overhead. Today I was Miss Carter again. I sat quietly near the center of the table while rain clouds drifted slowly beyond the skyline outside. Legal binders already waited beside my chair marked Governance Exposure Sequencing Review. The chief executive officer avoided looking directly at me until finally speaking with controlled frustration. The board believes Clause 8.4 created broader operational restrictions than anticipated. Anticipated. Another executive word designed to hide ignorance behind professionalism. I opened the binder calmly. Clause 8.4 did not create the restrictions, I replied quietly. The governance architecture responded to public executive retaliation exposure, exactly as designed. Silence filled the room immediately after that because every director there understood the implication now. The systems freezing executive authority were not malfunctioning. They were protecting the corporation from leadership behavior the corporation itself classified as dangerous years earlier. Then I turned another page inside the binder and noticed something that changed the entire atmosphere again. One final approval sequence remained unresolved overnight. And if it finalized automatically by noon, the chief executive officer would permanently Lose eligibility for succession authority inside Mercer Vale Holdings. The entire conference room changed after I pointed toward the unresolved approval sequence inside the governance binder. Nobody spoke immediately because every executive at that table understood the same thing at once. The systems freezing Mercer Vale Holdings were still moving forward without human intervention. Governance architecture does not stop simply because leadership becomes uncomfortable. Once activated, continuity protections continue processing until the corporation itself stabilizes again. Outside the skyscraper windows, gray Chicago clouds drifted slowly across the skyline while rainwater streaked down the glass behind the board of directors seated around the long polished table. The chief executive officer leaned forward first, his voice tighter now than any moment before. What exactly happens at noon? I looked down calmly at the binder before answering because the truth mattered more than diplomacy now. If the unresolved review sequence finalizes automatically, executive succession authority transfers into protected containment status, permanently pending shareholder review. Silence spread across the room again. Not confusion this time. Fear. Real fear. Because permanent succession containment meant the chief executive officer would effectively become trapped inside his current role without advancement eligibility, while the board completed a full governance exposure investigation. No acquisition authority. No leadership expansion.
No succession elevation. No strategic transition pasgua.
His career inside Mercer Vale would stop moving entirely. One outside attorney removed his glasses slowly, while reviewing the documentation again beneath the conference room lights. Can the sequence be reversed? He asked carefully. Not reversed, I replied quietly. Stabilized. That distinction mattered because governance systems were never designed for executive comfort. They were designed for institutional preservation. Around the table, directors exchanged exhausted looks while legal advisors continued turning pages through governance sequencing records most executives never bothered understanding until their own authority became vulnerable. Then the board chair finally spoke again. What stabilizes the sequence? I closed the binder softly. The corporation must demonstrate continuity restoration and independent governance compliance. The chief executive officer frowned immediately. Meaning what exactly? I met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. Meaning the board must formally acknowledge the public termination violated governance preservation safeguards during active restructuring review. Nobody moved after that. The city outside remained gray and silent beneath drifting rain, while the executive floor beyond the conference room walls stayed unnaturally quiet. Earlier that week, these same executives moved through the tower with complete confidence, believing titles created authority automatically. Now every sentence inside the room sounded careful because the systems beneath their authority had stopped trusting them. Around 11:15, the board voted privately for nearly 20 minutes while I waited alone beside the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Below the tower, traffic crawled through wet streets while office workers hurried beneath umbrellas without realizing an entire executive structure 42 floors above them was quietly collapsing under governance protections nobody outside the corporation would ever fully understand. Finally, the board chair approached me holding a signed resolution packet. The board is formally recognizing governance procedural failure connected to your termination, he said quietly. Independent review authority will remain active, but stabilization sequencing may resume immediately. There it was. Not an apology. Corporations rarely apologize sincerely. But it was accountability. Real accountability. Behind him, the chief executive officer sat silently at the far end of the conference table, looking older than he had yesterday morning when he publicly dismissed my department as redundant overhead. The board chair hesitated before continuing carefully. The directors would also like to restore your governance authority effective, immediately. Around the room nobody argued. Nobody even looked surprised anymore. Because after 24 hours of frozen compensation structures, stalled succession pathways, suspended executive authority, and collapsing internal confidence, everyone inside Mercer Vale finally understood the truth. The woman they humiliated publicly was never administrative support. She was the continuity structure holding the corporation together quietly the entire time. Then another notification appeared across the legal dashboard, projected on the conference room wall. Executive succession freeze status. Stabilization accepted. For the first time since the previous morning, the system had finally stopped escalating. The rain finally stopped sometime after noon, leaving downtown Chicago washed silver beneath pale winter light, reflecting across the glass walls of Mercer Vale Holdings. From the executive conference room windows, the city looked calm again. But inside the corporation everything had changed permanently. Governance stabilization protocols restored operational continuity across executive systems throughout the afternoon. Compensation approvals resumed carefully under independent oversight. Succession containment remained active temporarily, while the board finalized leadership reviews. The corporation survived. The executives who believed authority alone made them untouchable did not survive in the same way. By 3 o'clock, the Human Resources Director officially resigned pending governance investigation findings. 2 vice presidents connected to the public termination process quietly withdrew from succession consideration before the board forced the issue publicly. The chief executive officer remained inside his office most of the afternoon behind closed glass walls overlooking the river, isolated by the very governance architecture he dismissed as unnecessary bureaucracy less than 48 hours earlier. I spent the next several hours walking younger compliance analysts through stabilization procedures across governance systems they had never fully understood before this crisis. Their faces carried the same expression repeatedly. Not fear anymore. Respect. Quiet respect built from finally seeing the invisible structure underneath executive power. Around 5:30, the board chair requested one final private meeting before the day ended. The executive floor had grown unusually silent by then. Assistants moved carefully through hallways. Legal teams packed documents into secured cases. Outside the windows, sunset light reflected gold against wet streets below the skyscrapers while Chicago traffic flowed steadily beneath the fading storm clouds. The board chair stood near the conference room windows holding a formal restoration packet when I entered. The directors voted unanimously, he said carefully. We would like you to return permanently as Executive Governance Director with expanded authority over continuity protections. Expanded authority, higher salary, executive oversight. The kind of promotion corporations offer only after disaster forces them to recognize the value they ignored comfortably for years. I looked around the same room where I was publicly humiliated less than 2 days earlier beneath bright executive lighting while Human Resources slid termination paperwork across polished glass. Strange how quickly power changes shape once systems stop cooperating with ego. I appreciate the offer, I said quietly, but I will decline. The board chair blinked slightly, genuinely surprised. May I ask why? I walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline glowing beneath the evening light. Because corporations only notice infrastructure during collapse, I replied softly. And I spent 17 years preventing collapses nobody even knew happened. Silence settled gently across the room after that, because deep down he understood exactly what I meant. Governance work never feels important while systems function smoothly. Invisible labor only becomes visible once failure begins spreading publicly through the people who depended on it silently all along. Behind us, the conference room door opened quietly. The chief executive officer stood there looking exhausted, older somehow than he had 48 hours earlier. For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally, almost quietly enough to disappear into the room itself, he spoke. I should have listened. I met his eyes calmly because deep down I knew this was not really about me anymore. It was about power. About the dangerous arrogance executives develop when they mistake visibility for importance. You should have read the clause, I answered softly. No anger. No revenge. Just truth. The kind corporations spend millions trying to avoid hearing until systems force them to listen anyway. Around 6:15, I left Mercer Vale Holdings carrying the same leather portfolio I brought into the building the previous morning before everything changed. The lobby felt different now. Employees nodded respectfully as I crossed the marble floors toward the revolving doors. Outside, cold evening air moved through downtown Chicago while city lights shimmered across wet pavement beneath the towering glass skyline. Somewhere high above the streets, governance systems continued stabilizing quietly inside Mercer Vale Holdings exactly as designed. The corporation survived because the architecture still held. But the people who believed titles alone created power finally learned something they would never forget. Real authority inside a corporation rarely belongs to the loudest executive in the room. It belongs to the invisible people quietly preventing disaster long before anyone realizes disaster was coming.